My name's Will John from ADAS, and I work with Chris Creed in the horticultural team. Very knowledgeable bunch, as you know. But Delana asked me this evening to run through nutrient planning in horticulture. We'd done a bit of work a few years ago on a focus farm, which had some very interesting results, as you'll see. So I'll run through them through the course of the presentation. If I can, there we go. Yes, so whilst we're talking about nutrient planning, I couldn't really not talk about the bigger picture of soil health first. So we'll talk a bit about that and then really cover the main topics of why soil test. We're going to really talk about a standard soil analysis as opposed to the more complicated ones. We're then going to run through the results for the fruit farm and the recommendations, because there's a wide variety of crops grown, and I think we cover most things. So if we start with a bit on soil health, what do we know about soils? Well, it's complex, isn't it, really? There's a lot going on. The soils on your holding will be impacted on by the prevailing climate, the nutrient inputs, the geology, the crops you're growing, many different things. So we've got to get a head around the fact that this is not a simple thing to understand. But if we could condense it, we'd probably say that soil health really requires an integrated approach which links the chemical, physical, and biological attributes. And the preceding slide showed lots of things going on, but a scorecard, a more simplistic scorecard, has been developed by ADAS and partners, and it's to perhaps make it a bit more simplistic. So we have the box below which shows indicators, and there are 4 indicators. The first of which is the pH and routine nutrients, which a standard soil analysis would give us. So that's the soil phosphorus, potassium, and magnesium. And the benchmark is the RB209 guide. I don't know if you can see my screen. Here is this is section 7 on fruits and vines. Some great information in it. It's a free download, so if you haven't downloaded it, it's a good thing to do. In terms of the physical aspects, then, we have this visual assessment of soil structure, which has been developed by Scottish colleges. There's a similar thing developed in New Zealand, and I'll give you a link to it in the next slide. But at its most simple, it's taking a shovel full of, or a profile, soil depth, maybe 20 centimeters by 20 centimeters, and just analyzing it, really, breaking it up and seeing where the compacted layers are, if indeed there are any compacted layers. And then that'll give you a score of the physical, the bulk density of the soil. In terms of soil organic matter, then, I'm sure we'd get a question saying something like, what is the ideal soil organic matter level? And of course, there's no easy answer. Depending on your soil type, if you're on a peat, you could be 20% plus organic matter. If you're on a very sandy soil, you could be down at 2% organic matter. Probably 5 or 6% would be a good target, but inherently a clay soil would be higher than a sandy soil. So it's very important to know what sort of soil texture you have, because if you're a sandy soil, it may be just impossible to get the organic matter levels up to, say, 6%. But if you're a clay soil down at 4.8, that could be possibly a bit on the low side. And then last, but by no means least, we've got the earthworms, and I've got a great link to a visual guide in the next slide. Earthworms obviously very important in terms of soil health as an indicator. I'm sure everybody will have the opportunity to look at these slides later, So in terms of the soil health and soil structure, we've got the visual assessment of soil structure, and we've got the AHDB guide on earthworms, which you may have seen. In many ways, there's not much to learn about worms. There's about 3 main types. There's the, I'll get this right, the epigeic worms, which tend to live in litter in the first couple of inches of the soil structure. Then you'd have the endogeic topsoil earthworms, and down below the anisic earthworms. And they would be vertical burrowing, whilst the top 2 would be more horizontal. And if you were taking this shovelful of soil, digging a hole, just looking at the profile, you would expect to see worms from all 3 categories. And again, this fact sheet explains it very, very neatly. I suppose in a horticultural system where you may be cultivating a lot, that's not great for earthworms, but you'll still get a good feel for the health of the soil by certainly seeing their presence. So moving on now to why we should soil test, and I suppose there's 3 main reasons. It can save you money. So if you're putting too many inputs on the ground, one, you're wasting your money, and there could be environmental implications of it. And a soil test is going to pick that up, and a recommendation would be put on less. So potentially saving you money. Whilst at the other end of the spectrum, if you're quite a low input system and you're keen to improve productivity, then a soil test could flag up maybe deficiencies and give you the opportunity to address those and improve productivity. And finally, we touched on it at the beginning, but soil testing can improve the environment. I'm thinking, I suppose, really relating to the use of organic manures and implications for phosphates as much as anything, because as phosphate levels rise to the indices of 4s, 5s, and 6s, it does become more mobile and it can leach into watercourses. And phosphates in watercourses, in many ways, are worse than nitrates. So for the purposes of this evening, we're really going to dwell on the standard soil analysis, which is the starting point for most farmers and growers. And it's going to tell us the pH, or the lime requirement. In a horticultural setting, 6.5 really is where you need to be targeting. Obviously, there are crops like potatoes, which prefer lower pHs. Blueberries is another good example of something that prefers more acid conditions. But in terms of general cropping, 6.5 plus really is where you need to be. In terms of the soil phosphorus, the target index in a fruit and, well, in certainly a vegetable situation would be a targeted index of 3. And similarly for the K, or the soil potassium. And the magnesium, so these are the main macronutrients that we'd be testing for. Soil magnesium, again, a target index of 2 to 3. And if you're going to soil test or do it through Farming Connect, you'd identify plots that you need testing. And each plot would have a number of subsamples taken from it. And each of these subsamples, certainly in a horticultural system, we'd be wanting to take 15 centimetre cores. And these are walked generally in a W shape. The subsamples are mixed up and a representative sample taken to the lab. Relatively cheap in that it's about a tenner, including VAT per sample. And as we'll see, the information that you're going to get back is, can be very important. This is an example of a soil analysis report from NRM Labs. And you'll see in the middle, we've got the plot names. So we took analyses from the apples and the pears. I think gap 1, can't remember what that was, and currants, which is spelt incorrectly down the bottom. And you'll see from the soil pH that everything is well below 6, 4.5 particularly low, so no lime's been applied here for many years. And a standard analysis will give you a recommendation on what you need to address this balance. But when you have pH this low, it can't be turned around overnight. It's a long-term process. Moving on to the P, or the soil phosphorus, this is an index. I should have said that the pH scale in soils really will go from 4 to 8, 4.5 being very low, and when you get up into the 7s, that's quite high. But the soil phosphorus and the potassium and magnesium is, we look at an index system. So the indices for phosphorus will go 1, 2, 3, all the way up to 7s and 8s. So 0 is deficient. The pairs and the gap, they're index 2, and current index 5. I think they probably had a bit of chicken pellets or something to get the phosphate levels up. You'll see to the right of the screen that there's also figures in milligrams per litre. Now, what does this mean? These figures just enable you to get a better handle on the soil indices. So if we take apple bottom and the P index is 1, we would say therefore deficient, and it's 15 milligrams per litre. If you then look at the pears, index 2, okay, that's where it needs to be, but it's actually only 16 milligrams per litre. So the ability to look at the milligrams per litre figure will tell you more about where you are within these indices. And apple bottom is right at the top end of index 1, and actually the pears is right at the bottom index of index 2. We'll just run through the results for the fruit farm. 20 samples were taken, and in terms of the pH, we know soil pH is very important. Is vital to maximize the uptake of nutrients, and you'll see the results are all the wrong side of 6 for sure. 4.4, 4.5. It's rare to see that agriculturally. And then the highest samples were coming in at 5.6, 5.7, and there were a few issues about some crops not functioning too well, and this is really the starting point in looking at the results and how to address the deficiencies. In terms of the soil phosphorus then, there was a big variation over the plots. Now, the phosphorus is important for plants stimulating early plant growth, hastening maturity. Maize growers, for example, will often place phosphate when drilling with the seed, acknowledging the fact that it has this role in early plant development. And whilst we have about 10 fields in the index 2 to 3 range, we have 3 fields which are deficient at 0 to 1, and actually quite a few fields with quite high phosphorus indices. And whilst deficiencies can be a problem, toxicities or excesses are not something we want. We really want to be targeting neutrality. So a lot of stuff going on in these soils. In terms of the soil potassium then, the indices were all relatively where they need to be. I mean, index 3 is great for veg, but index 2 minus and 2 plus is not too far behind. And potassium is associated with the movement of water, nutrients, and carbohydrates. So again, an important macronutrient. And then finally, we have the soil magnesium. This again is a central core of chlorophyll in plant tissue, one of the major macronutrients, which we'll come back to later in the talk. Some of the fields are a bit high at index 4. In many ways, soil type can dictate the magnesium indices. Working around the BAF area, the soils are inherently high at index 5 to 6. It's just the way it is. And it's rare to see index 0 and even index 1. So if I could summarize what we found from those results, well, clearly the pH was very low. That's very much the priority for the farm. The phosphorus, very variable, extremely low, extremely high. In terms of potassium and magnesium, they were broadly okay where they needed to be. But a couple of interesting things we were told is that the raspberries in particular weren't performing. And actually, I'll jump onto this slide now. These are the raspberries, and look at the pH, it's down at 4.4 to 4.7. The phosphorus, or the P index, you know, you've got 5s and 7s, which is in itself is quite high. You look at the potassium and the magnesiums and you think, well, okay, that's fine. But actually, the milligrams per litre figure, you get an opportunity to look at the potassium-magnesium ratios. And if we take the example of, well, raspberries be at the top, 333 milligrams per litre of potassium, 94 magnesium, there's a ratio of in excess of 3 to 1, and that can be a problem. So if I just jump back up here, so the raspberries, low pH, this potassium-magnesium ratio was in excess of 3 to 1, which can induce magnesium deficiency. So plenty of things to address or plenty of reasons why these raspberries weren't performing. The apples weren't doing too badly, but the phosphorus indices were low for those, and that needed to be addressed. The vegetables were producing quite well, but they were grown on an area of fallow which had recently been ploughed out, and so nitrogen, which we don't talk a lot about in this talk, would have been released when ploughing out. So there would have been a good source of nutrients, and the weed and the pest burden would have been relatively low. So perhaps we would expect the veg to do quite well. Whether they would do moving forwards remains to be seen. So yeah, this is just the slide again showing quite an unusual set of results. So what do we do about these raspberries then? We tend to get our recommendations from the Nutrient Management Guide, RB209, which I mentioned earlier, and you've got the link here to download it free if you haven't done so already. So the starting point was lime. Now, obviously raspberries, it's a permanent crop. You don't really have the ability to cultivate. And I was chatting to Chris Creed about this, and he was saying, well, you just don't want to be leaving the lime sitting on the top. And he certainly advocated a bit of rotivation or even subsoiling in October to enable the lime to get down into the root zone. And with pHs of, say, 4.5, the actual lime requirement would be significantly higher than 5 tons per hectare. However, I think this is a case of starting to address low lime over a period of time. So this is the equivalent of 2 ton an acre. That actually, when we're talking about smaller plots, 0.5 kilogram per meter squared, which is maybe the sort of thing that's almost like a wheelbarrow and a shovel job, really. The potassium-magnesium ratio was something which really needed to be addressed, and kieserite was recommended as perhaps one of the best ways of going about this. This is magnesium sulfate and could be applied in March at about 200 kilos a hectare, which is obviously quite a low input. The phosphates were all quite high, so there's no requirement for more phosphate. And again, I think chicken pellets might have gone on this crop, and we certainly wouldn't be advocating that. You do have the ability to look at a leaf and a fruit analysis if you want to identify deficiencies or toxicities. Certainly where you've got high-end crops and potentially earning quite a bit of money, certainly spending a bit of money on these analyses could be worthwhile. But certainly the standard soil analysis that we took has pretty much flagged up a lot of things to be getting on with. We didn't really talk about nitrogen. This was an organic unit, so they wouldn't be able to use nitrogen. But there is a recommendation in RB209 for 70 kilos of nitrogen in the spring. There's also a small recommendation for potash or potassium. We suggested that perhaps we should concentrate on getting the magnesium levels back up before we applied that. But if the potassium-magnesium ratio wasn't a problem, maybe gone on with a product in a conventional system, going on with a product like K-nitro, which is nitrogen and potassium. That would have worked well. And a lot of the bigger growers, they'll have a bespoke fertilizer blend not made for them. Right, moving on to the orchards, the apples. They were a bit low in lime, I think 5.6s as opposed to 4.6s. Again, it's a permanent crop, but again, chatting with Chris, you were suggesting rotivation would be a good way to, down the alleys in particular, just to allow the lime to penetrate. And this would be a winter application. Again, we'd go on at the 5 ton per hectare level, which is about a half a kilo per meter squared. The potassium magnesium ratio was acceptable in the orchards, so we wouldn't be looking to use kieserite, just standard calcium carbonate. Historically, we've had questions about different types of lime. Obviously, prilled lime is something which is very easy to use for the smaller grower. You can't get around the fact that less goes on, so you're going on every year. So the ideal scenario would be a ground calcium carbonate. And calcium carbonate can vary from the quarry that you get it from. The more coarse it is, the longer it'll take to get down into the soil. And the finer it is, the more risk of liming your neighbour's fields. I think the big thing for the orchards, they were deficient in phosphate. And as an organic unit, GAFSA would be an organic approved fertilizer. It's the equivalent of about 400 kilos a hectare, which isn't a lot really. That equates to 0.04 kilos per 10 square meters. And it should be noted that GAFSA, generally, it sort of works better in more acid conditions. And liming and GAFSA at the same time, they don't really go hand in hand. So having spoke to my colleague, Paul Newell-Price, who's a bit of a specialist in this area, he still thinks getting the lime right first is the way forward. So you'd concentrate on the lime, and then maybe 6 months later, concentrate on the GAFSA and the phosphates. If you were non-organic, triple superphosphate in the spring would be the way to get around the deficiency, and you wouldn't have to worry about the issues of liming. One good reason for downloading the RB209 booklet is you do get, apart from just a straight recommendation for nitrogen, you do get some extremely useful information, and the sort of thing you pick up in there is certainly in apples, you don't want to be building up the K index too high because it can adversely affect the storage quality. So it is a good bedtime read. And finally, then the vegetable patch, and we concentrated mainly on the salads here. Lime was required, but because this is a cultivated area, it is feasible to actually plow in lime and surface treat it, so you can get more on. We didn't have any high issues with potassium magnesium ratios in this plot. Salads do have a high requirement for P&K, and in an organic system, your hands are tied to a certain extent, and rotation planning plays a big role in terms of fertility building and putting compost and organic manures back on the ground. I suppose conventionally, it's much easier to revert to bagged fertilizers, which will have quite high nutrients in them, such as a 1616 or a 02030. Nitrogen, again, we haven't really talked too much about it, and the crops all have a huge range. So if you're growing leguminous crops, they don't need any nitrogen. Onions, leeks, potatoes, much higher requirement for nitrogen. So again, organically, that's all about the rotation design and the ploughing out to maximize the gains from doing that. Worth reiterating that if you're low in the potassium and you need potash, then an organic derogation is generally required from your certification body. And there is a difference between the different types of certification body on how likely you are to get a derogation. And yes, in this instance, organic approved chicken pellets were used, which had a little bit of N, P, and K in them. And they were probably used too liberally on the raspberries with the higher indices. So those are recommendations specific to the crops. A couple of things to bear in mind really then are the soil organic matter. In a stockless system on a sandy soil with no organic manures being returned, you're likely to suffer from low organic matter levels. Where you have the ability to return manures and composts, clearly that's a good way forward. It's really important, though, that you're aware, if you're in an assurance scheme, how they apply to your holding. There are Food Standards Agency, fresh produce standards, and any inputs really need to be carried out in accordance with the Safe Applications to Land matrix. Broadly speaking, salads in particular, if you were looking to import a compost, well, it would need to be PAS 100, and it really needs to be applied well before any crops are planted. I haven't really talked about polytunnels, protective cropping. It is a slightly different beast where liquid feeds, irrigation plays a more important role. You would test for electrical conductivity. This is slightly out of my area of expertise, but it's all about the salinity, and the crops need to be monitored because they will respond poorly if the EC is at the wrong level. In a grassland situation, we'd normally advocate testing every 4 or 5 years. You probably don't need to do it every year, but with these higher value produce, and particularly with these fairly variable results, you might want to repeat the tests every 2 to 3 years, because you'd want to see those lime levels going up, and you'd like to sort of address that potassium magnesium balance. We're coming to an end, but the soil health then, it's such a big area, and there's a number of different approaches going on. I sat in on FERA's big soil community. This is looking at the DNA of bacteria and fungi in the soil. It was a bit over my head. One thing I did take from it was there are millions of bacteria and fungi, and actually I think over half of them were not known to science. So they weren't actually able to indicate whether they were positive or negative. So definitely one for the future, but that's the way the research is going. Delana mentioned EIPs earlier. I was interested to come across this German EIP, which looks as mycorrhiza fungi as a green alternative for mineral fertilizers. The results, I think it's an ongoing project but I'll read this out. The mycorrhiza had a positive effect on the yield and biomass of soybeans and corn in an organic system, but the potato farmer didn't get any response. So again, I think this is something which, it's ongoing, it's interesting, and we need to keep an eye on it. So that's pretty much it from me. Just wanted to say that Delana's already said it, but Farming Connect funding, it can help you with a one-to-one or a group nutrient plan, which our horticultural specialist would be, more than happy to come out and talk to you. Although I think they're known to a lot of you anyway. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Will. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, that was very informative. Sorry I left you in a bit of a rush, but I think our power outage has been restored by Swalek now. While you're thinking of some questions for Will, there have been a couple that have come in. First of all, what time of year should you be doing soil sampling in a horticulture situation? We're told on farms that you shouldn't do it when you're actually actively applying fertilizers, so it should be done sort of in the autumn time. When would you fit it in a horticulture situation?
Yes, well, that's the most important thing, really. If you're going out with fertilizers or organic manures, indeed, then you really need to be giving a couple of months. Also, extremes should be avoided. So, well, I suppose this year was a classic example, wasn't it? February, it was under about 2 foot of water, so that would have just been saturated, and then by the end of May, the ground was like concrete. So you just want to avoid extremes, and where you are within your cropping system, but back end of the year generally is a good time to do it.
Thank you. And then how many samples should you be taking off a given area of land, and how do you decide how many samples to take?
Right, well, there is a prescription within RB 209 for how many samples, and I mean, I said 20 in my talk. I actually can't remember if it's 20 or 25, but you don't take one. You just don't go into the middle and you take one. What's important is that you choose a homogeneous block of land. So you might have a 1 acre plot, but if that 1 acre plot is partly steep, partly flat, you consider that 2 separate plots. I've got a colleague in the north of England who works on a arable farm, and the field is 100 acres. And I think he's been working, it's been a 100-acre field for many, many years, completely homogeneous, soil type doesn't change at all. And he'll take 25 samples, mini samples from that field, because he knows it's extremely homogeneous. So I know it can be a laborious process taking lots of mini samples. For the fruit farm, some of the areas we were sampling were quite small, but I certainly had 20 in the bag. The more you take, the better average you're going to get. You're going to iron out any anomalies. But if you know, for example, an area had more manure last year, or there was something subtly different, then you would just treat it as a separate plot. So I don't think I really mentioned that in the talk.
Thank you. And a question has come in here. When is the best time to apply well-rotted farm manure as a good source of nutrients?
Right. So again, I would refer you back to the assurance schemes, and there are definitions of, I think, just standard manure, stacked manure, but there's a reference to composted manure, and ideally it would be well composted, and you would certainly want to give it a couple of weeks, if not a couple of months, before it can go in. But what I'll do, I will actually just confirm that, because it slipped my mind whether it's a number of weeks. In fact, that RAP report that I sent you, that would certainly have it. But yeah, unfortunately, my mind has failed me there. We'll just have to get back to you on that one.
Right, and the next question, is there a cover crop for vineyard floor which would help fix nutrients or be otherwise beneficial? 6.2 pH, potassium is low, thank you.
Okay, could you read that out again, please, Delilah?
Is there a cover crop for vineyard floor which would help fix nutrients? or be otherwise beneficial?
Right. I suppose the thing that jumps out at you really is, will it be competing with the vineyard? Because if you have a cover crop, they are good at scrounging nitrogen, and we think of things like mustard, don't we? So my first thoughts would be, are they going to be scavenging nitrogen and nutrients, which to the detriment of the vineyard? And something else we didn't really talk about was the soil nitrogen supply within any plot. You can do a soil mineral nitrogen test, which involves digging a soil pit and taking analyses from different depths and sending it off to the lab. Alternatively, there is a paper-based version of doing a soil nitrogen supply. If you do get involved with RB209 or even downloading Planet for Farmers, which is the software, you do get quite useful messages. And the sort of messages we had in February this year was, because of the excess rainfall, the soil mineral nitrogen is actually going to be quite low because it's all been washed out. And on one of our EIPs, we did actually carry out a soil mineral nitrogen, and we were surprised how low the nitrogen levels were. So was the cover crop, was it about soil erosion, or was it more about pest control or weeds?
It says to fix nutrients, help to fix nutrients, or be otherwise beneficial.
Right. Well, I think in a lot of instances, the alley or the area below the crop will be kept free of vegetation, and I think competition is probably going to be a worse outcome.
Okay, thank you. And the next question, we have an old orchard on a Gloucester advanced farm. Will lime help with canker on old apple trees? If not, what else?
Do you know what the pH is? Would be the first question, isn't it?
It doesn't say that, unless Catherine would like to send an answer.
That would have to be the starting point, wasn't it? I mean, again, if the pH is 5.2, then yes, obviously lime would be a good starting point. If the pH is 6.5, then there's no real, there's no way. The lime obviously isn't the problem.
Oh, right. We have an answer from Catherine, and it says 5.5, around 5.5.
Okay, so a little bit on the low side. I think the orchard here was about 5.6, and so, well, lime would be the starting point. And I believe you are allowed to use lime within Gloucester, obviously double check, but whether you would be able to rotivate, possibly not. So always go back to your Gloucester management plan or talk to your project officer just to make sure that you're doing it by the book.
And will that help with canker on old apple trees?
Okay, well, we'll have to get back to you on that one, I'm afraid. That's one for Chris Creed.
All right. Good. Another question is, there's a local organic poultry farm nearby. Is poultry manure worth using? And it is organic for an organic unit. Right.
Well, it's rocket fuel. Do you know if it's layer or broiler?
I think it's layer.
Okay, I'm just having a quick look at my RB209, because things like farmyard manure can be quite a variable commodity, but anything coming out of these chicken sheds, particularly the more modern chicken sheds, is actually quite standard. So you can pretty much have a good idea of what you're getting. Bear with me whilst I have a look for the poultry manure. Again, you would have to be very wary of applying this if you're going to be growing salads or anything like that, part of the assurance scheme, and we need to just get back to you in terms of the delay, certainly before any planting goes on. But layer manure, which is around 40% dry matter, that's got about 19 kilos of nitrogen per ton, if we work out on a per ton basis. Now, that's not all available, but if you are applying it, it's about 30% available. So it is a good source. What crops were we talking about on this farm?
I think they're vegetable, field vegetables.
Okay. It is, well, it's a good source of nitrogen, it's a good source of phosphate and potash and sulfur and magnesium, but you do have to be wary. I would always talk to the certification body, and we'll just have to get confirmation on these periods before which you can actually use it on the because depending on the different type of crop, anything from arable crops to grass crops to the different types of produce, and salads will be different from potatoes, for example. They'll all have slightly different recommendations.
Thank you. And then composted green waste. Is it a balanced source of nutrients? How much would it vary? And is it worth getting it analysed?
Right, okay. Well, this is a more variable commodity, I think, than chicken manure. And there are different types of compost. Again, I'm looking at my RB209 here. You'll have the green waste, and you can have green waste and food. You'd have to look at PAS 100 as the standard, and if it's being imported, the contractor who is importing it should really be clear about the recommendations. And again, this is in this wrap guide, where he can spread it and how heavy he can spread it. The thing about the compost is it's a good source of organic manure. You can't get away from that. There is nitrogen in it, but I had a sneaky feeling this might come up. So I was just reading the small print, and what RB209 actually says is there's the actual nitrogen is very minimal, actually. There is an amount of phosphate and potash, and I've got a figure here for 30 tons per hectare. This is green compost, and this was actually going to supply about 90 kilos of phosphate and actually 204 kilos of potash. What it doesn't tell you is you'll also have microplastics and stuff like that in it. So anything you import, there's good and bad. So you have to be aware of that. But it's undoubtedly organic matter is perhaps the best attribute of it.
Thank you. I think we've managed to get through all the questions.
Yeah.
So I would just like to remind you again that this service is available through Farming Connect, the nutrient management planning. If you would like to do an expansive acreage, then it's probably better to go as an individual with the 80% funding. But if you've got a few acres, like a horticulture site, it'd be well worth contacting your local development officer, seeing if you can get it into a group with other local growers, and you can all benefit from having the group funding, and that will be 100% funded.